here at the library today for our first author talk of Kānaka O Ke Kai, which is a talk story series celebrating the deep connection between Native Hawaiians and the ocean. And I am thrilled to introduce today's Kānaka Vai, Dr. Isaiah Helekunihi Walker. Dr. Walker was born and raised in Hale, Hawaii, and prior to becoming the academic vice president at BYU Hawaii, Walker was a history professor in the Faculty of Language, Cultural and Performing Arts, served as a chair of the Faculty Advisor Council, and previously chaired the history program. He's the author of Waves of Resistance, Surfing and History in the 20th-Century Hawai, in which he analyzes colonialism from the unique perspective of Native Hawaiian surfers. Walker has published several academic articles and book chapters in peer-reviewed publications, as well as non-academic audiences such as PBS. He has also served as a consultant historian on several documentaries and as a commentator at professional surfing competitions. So without further ado, please join me in extending a warm aloha to Dr. Walker.
All right. Aloha mai kako, aloha. Aloha. Thank you for coming. It's Tuesday and it's 2 o'clock, and I didn't think anybody was going to be here, so this is exciting for me. Again, it's a privilege to be here, to be able to share some of my mana'o and some of my journey too, of how this came about. And really it's a passion project, but it's also a reflection of my life. And I think whenever you, especially as Indigenous scholars and people who write work that's kind of self-reflexive, you kind of take a piece of you and you put it into your work, and which is good and bad, right? It's good because you're able to put a lot of personal touches to it, and it's a reflection of yourself. You're kind of imbuing, like it's your Horcrux, I guess, for Harry Potter fans. But at the same time, it also leaves you a little vulnerable, right? Because you realize that, like, oh wow, I'm talking about myself. Kind of funny, my wife once joked shortly after I was giving a lot of talks in my book, she was like, you have this whole section on masculinity, are you okay? So I don't know, I think I am. But anyway, so a lot of times what we do in our research really is a reflection of ourselves. So a lot of the stories I'll share today about my research also weaves it a bit about myself and my experiences as part of the water, part of the ocean, part of the kai, and so the po'ina nalu, where the waves break. Okay, so let's get into it. There's our mic, it's working now. Okay. So a bit my journey of writing this book. This was one of the first actual academic books that was published on the history of surfing. A lot of people have explored, the history of surfing, but from my opinion, in less academic ways. I guess you could say Ben Finney wrote a book, and he's an academic in anthropology. As you know, Ben Finney was part of the Hokulea first voyage and was very much so connected to the ocean. But he wrote a piece that was called Surfing the Sport of Kings, right? But it really was less academic in its approach. And I felt that there were a lot of books that were written decades ago that seemed to shape a narrative about surfing history that others just sort of piggybacked on. Now the problem with that is when the first canon isn't very accurate, and those of you that study Hawaiian history and other types of history as well, it just sort of perpetuates these narratives that aren't necessarily true. It's not just about truth and fiction, but it's also about representation. So there were certain themes throughout surfing history, and then of course it becomes popular with documentary films and other types of things, and as surfing becomes more and more popular throughout the world, people naturally talk more and more about it. But as a surfer who was born and raised in Hilo, and also my grandmother was born in Waikiki, and she used to surf. She lived in Kalia. Today, where she grew up, is now Fort DeRusi. This was before they condemned it. We had 4.5 acres of beachfront property. Anyway, but her experiences during that time, and I've always been fascinated with the turn of the 20th century, and I think a lot of Hawaiian historians, I think we haven't done enough about the 20th century in Hawaii, especially the turn of the 20th century. Oftentimes, the annexation, the occupation of Hawaii kind of dominates the narrative, but there's a lot of interesting things that take place thereafter. So I had a vision basically to tell versions of stories from my experiences, from surfer and being Kānaka, and having my version of what the surf experience was as a child was quite different from what I was watching in movies and on TV shows and so forth. So I studied at BYU Hawaii when I was a young teenager, and then when I was on the campus there, I was a history major, and I had to come up with a senior project. And I was enjoying Hawaiian history, especially that time in the 1990s. That's when things were coming out really new and fresh. You had Noinoi Silva's book that came out. You had Lili Kalakameleiva, and you had several others that were just sort of, it was kind of a burgeoning time. And so I was fascinated with that, but I wanted to contribute, but from a vantage that I was comfortable with and I felt was an important part of the story. And so I met some folks who worked on campus. There's one guy named Imbert Soren, and he was a carpet layer at BYU Hawaii. And I came to find out that he was one of the founders of the infamous club, the Hui o He'enalu. And as a child, I'd watched the movie North Shore. I also had some uncles that would live on the North Shore and then come back to surf Honolulu, and they was wearing the hui shorts, and it was kind of like this, kind of this aura about them. It was kind of scary, like, who are these guys? And so I became fascinated when I was like, I want to tell the story of the hui, like, that'd be pretty cool. But I was a little nervous, and then when I met Imbert, what struck me mostly was how much aloha he had. I showed up and I told him what I wanted to do, and we were in this back office in the facilities management building, and he brought me all kinds of stuff. He brought me a shirt, he brought me some lunch, and he was like, oh, bro, yeah, like, nobody ever did like tell this story before. Like, yeah, I go share my side of this story. And it really shaped the way that I approached telling this story, because I realized, like, wow, there's this whole voice of people who are part of this that haven't had a chance to really tell their side of the story. Because in newspapers and so forth, when I went back and looked at them, whenever they're in surf magazines and surf videos and so forth, it was always referred to them in context of like terrorists, of drug dealing, and a bunch of other things. Now, it's not to say that all of the club members were fine citizens who were always like stellar, but at the same time, like, most of them that I met were. And the stories and the narrative that they shared with me wasn't about those things. It was about preserving and protecting a space that to them was significant, which was the surf. And what also fascinated me was that they were successful at it, regardless of the way that, like, they were perpetuated or they were stigmatized and so forth. They were in many ways able to maintain their dominance in a space that was very Hawaiian. But it was interesting because a lot of times people would see surfing as not Hawaiian, like, oh, that's what the Hale guys do, or it's a California thing. But from my experience growing up in Hilo, most of the uncles I looked up to were all Hawaiians. And also on the North Shore, interviewing these folks, I realized, like, wow, they're articulating themselves and their experience in a story that is very familiar to Hawaii's conquest. So I started to dive deeper into that. So then getting people to support me in this was my next adventure. So for my undergrad, I just wrote a 25-page paper, and Then I went to school and studied under David Stannard at UH Manoa for a master's degree there. And he was like a really good advisor. And he helped me to shape really a lot of my research work and perspective. And then I went to UC Santa Barbara, where I followed he was a former UH professor named Paul Spickard, where he did ethnic studies. And I spent 4 years at UC Santa Barbara. And I had to justify what I was doing because I wanted to keep going on this route. And oftentimes, especially at that time, the early 2000s, I would get up and introduce myself in front of fellow graduate students, and they would talk about what they're studying, and I would be like, well, I'm studying the history of Hawaii, but really through the avenue of surfers. And you'd get weird looks, and sometimes people would kind of like, is that really academic? Luckily, we live in a time where, I think academia has changed to where we're much more receptive of things that are outside of the box. But that time, it was a little bit of a struggle. But I had a supportive advisor. So I guess my message here for those of you doing research, working in the library, surround yourselves with people who believe in you and people who trust what you're doing. Because in the end, after I finished my dissertation and I published a few articles and I got a book contract, and then all of a sudden, like, my book became cool, right? Like, New York Times did a story on it, and then a bunch of other folks were reaching out to me, and then it was kind of ironic, but also, I guess, validating that our history department there in Santa Barbara had like a newsletter, and then I became sort of like the face of the department, which before I definitely wasn't. So anyway, surround yourself with people who support you, important. So as far as the book, Kapu'ina Nalu, the breaking zone of the waves, constitutes a Native Hawaiian realm, an overlooked space extremely significant to Native Hawaiians. Another perspective, observing history from the vantage of the ocean, issues of colonialism, politics, and resistance appear strikingly different. It's kind of one of the main points of the book, is that the ocean represents a space that's a little different than what happens on land. And interestingly, you can still see the contrast today. I took a group of students once. We went to Waikiki to just observe. One of the chapters focuses on the Waikiki Beach Boys. And we went there and we were just kind of doing some observations. We went on canoe rides and we're trying to connect with that story. And there was one of my students who said, I had an interesting observation that really supports the thesis of the book. He said, I watched this one guy, when he was in the water, he was like, kind of like the man out there. Like, people respected him, they all knew his name, called him uncle, he caught whatever waves he wanted, and he seemed to have some social status. She said, then I saw him coming on the beach, put his board on the rack, walk across the street, and put on a valet coat, and all of a sudden, it instantly switched. People were telling him what to do, where to go, and she was like, it's interesting how the beach, which Greg Denning talks about the beach as this buffer of contact when Captain Cook comes in, and the beach becomes this interesting divide from two worlds, right? I feel like likewise with surfers today, a lot of them have that experience. So on land, Hawaiians were marginalized, as I just kind of articulated, in many places, from social and economic spheres, yet the ocean, Hawaiians could secure kind of a position in that hierarchy. It was also really cool, my timing of doing this project, ulukau.org, I just put out a lot of work, and so did nupepa.org and others, and I mahalo them for doing that, because I'll never forget the first time that these websites opened up. I typed in He'enalu, hit enter, and I just saw all these entries come up, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a treasure chest for historians. So it was awesome to tap into so many mo'olelo. I mentioned earlier that there were certain authors that had written about surfing. Most of their work was only done in English sources and was kind of limited. And so in Hawaiian sources, there's tons of stuff. But one thing that really intrigued me and that I wanted to make sure to shift, I've talked about some of these narratives that I think got it wrong. One of those goes back to even the title of one of Ben Finney's books, The Surfing is the Sport of Kings. and I don't think maybe he intended on this, but what it did, it associated surfing with only kings, and the concept that it was a regal sport, and it then became a tool for validating those who had kind of inherited surfing. And then the story, in order to really like, the narrative goes that like, well, surfing used to be the sport of these kings, and then it disappears, and then it reemerges with people like Alexander Hume Ford, this guy from Boston who came to Hawaii and learned to surf, and it's handed on to Tom Blake and so many others, and then to Australia, and then it becomes no longer kind of a Hawaiian sport or pastime or cultural. So a lot of those stories would be like surfing died. So that was one of the things I was adamant about showing, is that clearly through so many different sources, we see that surfing exists and is written about throughout the 1800s. In fact, I had a fun exercise with this photograph right here, one of the oldest photographs known of a surfer or surfing. And when this came out, there was an archivist who had determined that this must have been Waikiki, because it was in the 1890s. Must have been Waikiki because surfing didn't exist anywhere else. I grew up in Hilo, and I know this wave. And something cool about surfers who have been surfing for a long time, it's like a fingerprint, right? You recognize a wave. And I was like, no way, this is Bayfront. I grew up surfing this wave. I know exactly how it breaks, what it looks like. I can tell by that limu there that there's like rocks in the river. And anyway, so I put it out there. I actually put it out in my book. I said, some people say that this is in Waikiki because surfing apparently only exists at Waikiki. I said, but I argue that it's probably Hilo. Boom, and then this photo was discovered. They found out that there was more than one photo in that reel. There were multiple. This is the same gentleman. And now we have a landmark in the background. It's the Haumakua coastline. I don't know if you can see it over there. My laser pointer isn't working, and then you can see more of it. So anyway, I brought my son and my nephew to the same location just to show that I was right. So the Hawaiian Surf Zone, some key points from my work is it's a place of refuge, a unique space of often Hawaiian autonomy, where folks had the freedom to defy prescriptions of how men should behave, colonial prescriptions, meaning that especially at the turn of the 20th century, you had a lot of new kinds of social norms that existed primarily. A lot of them gender-based, also just, Western notions of what it means, for example, for women to be proper, right? Or for interracial relationships to take place, which in most of the United States were actually legally outlawed. But in the surf zone, we see, examples of people like Duke Hanamoku and the Waikiki Beach Boys, who were behaving in ways that I think American society frowned upon. But there was because of that sense of autonomy and empowerment and identity, that there was a comfortability, a confidence in just being themselves. Originally they were called the Huinalu clubs. Today still we have the paddling club called the Huinalu. They were also Waikiki Beach Boys, known as pretty successful, running successful and lucrative businesses on the beach, especially at that time. They became very popular. And it's interesting because the way that Waikiki is set up today, there's so many buildings now, but like the amphitheater, in my opinion, it's still nostalgic for that center of what they were doing. They were bringing so much mana and aloha and so much fun to that amphitheater there of the surfing in Queens and Kaliguavehe and Waikiki and so forth, that it's nostalgic for what they brought to that place. I want to leave time for some questions. I did have some video clips, but I'll kind of fast forward through those. In that video basically is Clyde Kau. In the 1960s, he says, as kids walking up the beach, watching the luau's and the music, us kids were he felt like they were not wanted on Waikiki property. And he's in the film, he's kind of tearful about it. He says, that's what really hurts. And he talks about how him and Eddie then went and started to learn how to surf. And he said surfing made us feel like kings. So I think that's very interesting. And back to that Greg Denning concept of the beach as this buffer, that on property, it's interesting that he used the word property. He didn't use aina or land, or talking about property, a sense of ownership. He felt excluded. But in the ocean, he felt like a king. Like, what a contrast for, and he's talking about when he was a young kid, that sense of like who you are and your importance in the society, that surfing had that ability to be a completely different realm of existence. I also, like I mentioned earlier, the book starts with the story of the Hui He'enalu in the 1970s, and they did, in many ways, a lot of the same types of things that the Hui Nalu Club did in Waikiki. Something that, one of the most fascinating finds of my research was, I went to the Outrigger Club, because the Outrigger is actually founded originally in 1906 by this guy named Alexander Hume Ford, who came here from Boston, and he realized that like he could promote some of these things to the islands for tourism, and he formed this club called the Outrigger Club. And when they first formed, and for actually the first few decades of his existence, it was a segregated club, like it was for whites only, and Duke and his boys at the Hui Nalu formed a club that wasn't racially segregated. Anyone could join it. Men, women, of all ages. You had a lot of Kanakas, you had folks who were visitors, but it was mainly these Hawaiians that lived in Waikiki. And they basically asserted themselves in this space, and in the end, like they were recognized as the chiefs of this area. And I went to the archives, and this is where being a white Hawaiian came in handy. And I was like, hi, I'm here I want to see if I could get some access to your archives. And so they were cool about it. And so they gave me some of the original founding stories of when they first formed. And as I read through the minutes and looked at the roster of the folks that were joining this club at this time, it was the same names of the folks that we hear about in 1893. So the Sanfords, Sanford Doles, all of the folks that were involved with the overthrow were the same names joining this club, and I was just blown away by it. And I realized what was happening was it was an extension of the battles that took place on land had made their way out into the ocean. Because in the Hui Nalu Club, you also had some founding members like Prince Jonah Kuhio, who was in that same battle too. And Liliuokalani's name was amidst there too, even though I don't think she surfed at all, but just, it was interesting how these beach clubs in the surf were taking that same battle into the waves. And like I said, the outcome was very different. A lot of it had to do with just the nature of the ocean. You can't necessarily fence it or police it or control it. And it's also a space that was predominantly Hawaiian, that Hawaiians were still able to maintain that significance in that space. So not only that time, then again in the 1970s, you have the stories of spaces of access to the ocean being threatened. It's probably at its highest than it's ever been, to be honest. Like, it never stops, which is unfortunate. Like, it's always a battle. Access to beaches. The North Shore now, have only one or two friends that I know that are still kind of local to the North Shore that own their place. Access to the ocean, ability to afford the equipment to go surfing, these types of things is increasingly a struggle. But at the same time, you always have these individuals and groups that are working to preserve that space. And that's what I found with this group, the Hui He'enalu. I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. The one thing that's interesting, one of the things that they were protesting, the Hui, was that in the 1970s they started a professional surfing circuit, and the North Shore became this kind of the mecca of surfing for the professional world, and it still is in many ways today. but they would have permits. They still have permits today, but they would have like lots of events that they would have there, and they would, a lot of these events were invitation by invitation only. Interestingly, and ironically, one of the first of these invitations was called the Duke Invitational. But in many ways, Duke wasn't necessarily the one organizing the event. They kind of used his name and his image to popularize it. And the first event they had, there was one Native Hawaiian that was invited. His name was Kealoha from Laie. But Eddie Aikau showed up with Ben Aipa, and they're like, bro, we like surf. And they're like, oh, you wasn't invited, sorry. He paddled out anyway, him and Ben, and they surfed around these guys. And then afterwards, apparently the story is that Duke talked to some of the organizers of the event, said like, hey, why not invite these guys? They look pretty good. So the next year they were invited. So there's a lot of conflict between ownership of the waves. And the Hui, when they were formed, that was primarily their whole agenda, was like, right, you cannot come over here and claim that you have exclusive rights to all these places, kick our kids out of the water, tell us we cannot surf while you have this window. So as I interviewed more and more of these guys, they were a bit more edgy. They'd be like, wow, we just paddle out. What you gonna say to me? You say anything, I'm gonna crack you. So it was a different time, before cell phones and things, but it was pretty raw. But there was a sense of like, we have to protect this space. And so eventually, though, interestingly, they do come to a compromise, which is unique. They're like, all right, you want to have your events here, you hire us. We'll do the water patrol, we'll do the security stuff. You also let our people in the competitions, and you got to limit it. You can't just have it endless windows of time for the whole season. You have to shorten it. And then now today you have events like the Backdoor Shootout, the Eddie Memorial, a lot of these events that do have like a more of a local and Hawaiian flavor to them. And here's a quote by Moana Jones Wong. She says, the Hui Backdoor Shootout always gets the best waves, 100%. The waves come to the Backdoor Shootout because the mana of the event. So again, you have even the athletes who are recognizing a difference in the spirit of the events and the purpose of them. And in competition also, interestingly, and I believe this is my argument, that because Hawaiians fought so hard to preserve the surf zone as a Hawaiian space, that the surfing world recognizes Hawaiian as an independent and distinct people from the United States, even though maybe not formally, but in practice they do. So for example, Carissa Moore has won multiple world championship titles. Every time she does, she's wearing the Hawaiian flag and representing Hawaii, which no other state in the US does. You don't have a California team or East Coast, Florida, or anything like that. I don't know if you've noticed there's some kind of manipulation of an image in Honolulu. There's that big mural of her and Duke. They take that from a photo when she won the Olympics. Now, as Keanu Tsai knows, he and I worked together on this project to try and get Hawaii its own team into the Olympics. And we're making progress. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're getting places. But the idea of recognizing Hawaii, like a Hawaiian Kingdom national team, is something that we've been trying to pursue because the surfing world already recognizes it. But when the first Olympics in Japan with surfing, she won, she wasn't flying the Hawaiian flag, she was flying the American flag, but I love how in Honolulu they changed the flag. She's carrying a Hawaiian flag in that big mural. Still in the events that are like the Junior Olympics, to this day Hawaii has its own team, and it's interesting to watch Hawaiian surfers represent Hawaii. And some folks like Ezekiel Lau, one of he was one of the top professional surfers from Hawaii, says here that being a Hawaiian means everything to me. I'm wearing that out on my sleeve. It's in my blood, my roots. It's what I was born to do. So, as mentioned, I've had opportunities to not only do academic work and presentations, but also I really enjoy, this is really fun for me to teach history in surfing broadcasts. I just realized I'm wearing the same shirt. I promise I own others. Oh well, I guess it's one of my favorites. But anyway, so I've had the opportunity of doing this at every year at the Backdoor Shootout at Pipeline, and then also with the Eddie on occasion. So it's been really fun, but you don't need to watch that. I was just going to show you that, like, oh, you want to? Okay. Okay, we'll see. I don't know if this has audio or not, but we'll try and cue it up.
Speaking of Duke Kahanamoku,
Oh, it doesn't.
today is actually the day that Duke passed away.
No, that is not me. That is not a video of me surfing. That was just me showing an example of the type of commentary that we do. Sorry, the audio isn't working, but we were talking about Duke Kahanamoku at the Eddie event, and I was talking a bit about how Eddie represented this next generation from Duke, and how Duke, when Eddie was in the Duke Invitational, that Duke gave Eddie this trophy, and it was this transfer of, like, from one generation to the next. And the point of that is, and one of the key points of my work is to show that there's kind of this unbroken chain of continuity, of cultural continuity that surfing provides. And even though people surf on modern equipment, it doesn't make it any less Hawaiian. In fact, much of the development in surfing technology and shaping and so forth comes from a lot of Hawaiians that were involved with the process. So I really like to emphasize that point. So when I was invited to come to the library, the email had some specific timelines of what I should be doing. I think it's time for me to read from my book, which is kind of weird for me. But I guess we'll do that. And we have some kids in the room. Maybe they'll like some of my story time here today. We'll just do something really short here. All right, so this comes from page 17. And hopefully you can see that. So, asked to read some of my favorite parts here. Here's one on page 17. Although several men, gods, and chiefs liked to surf, female surfers were far more popular in Hawaiian histories. One example is Hi'iaka I Kapoleo Pele, the youngest sister of goddess Pele, the fire goddess Pele. While traveling around the island of Oahu, Hi'iaka had an unfriendly encounter in the surf in the Ko'olau district on the east side of the island. When Hi'iaka and her traveling party approached Kahana Valley, she appropriately called up to the chief of that area with a oli kahea. Sorry, I guess my eyes are getting old. I can't see too good. Palani and his wife Ievale, known as the surfing chiefs of Kahana, were in the ocean surfing at the time. Perhaps annoyed by this oli, Palani answered Hi'iaka with contempt, shouting, "Ai, o Palani wau, o ke li'i he nalu o kia aina o Kahana nei, o vai hoi oi na wahine ho kano, o kauhele ana mai ne a kahea mai iau, o ike mai no paha oi iau, he nalu ana me ku'u wahine, he wahine i ke ole no ka oi iau kalamai. O ka'u puni no nei, o vai ho'i oi." I like to do it in Pidgin better. It's in English over here. Here's my Pidgin translation. How's it? You know that? I'm Palani, the chief of this land, Kahana. Who are you? Tira, come in over here, trying to call me out. What, you never see me and my wife surfing over here? Bruh, I don't know you. I run this gulch. Who are you? Anyway, so this is an example of one of the mo'olelo that I was able to uncover with some of our Hawaiian language newspapers. And anyway, it's pretty fun to uncover so many of these mo'olelo that are in our histories. I'll keep going. Angered by Palani's disrespectful response, Hi'iaka caused the waves to quickly rise. As both Palani and his wife tried to catch the fast-growing surf, the giant waves overcame them, eventually consuming and killing both of them. Another story, Kapu'ula Kina'u, a surfer and sorceress of Kauai, was another Hawaiian woman who demanded respect in the Hawaiian surf. Determined to find suitable husbands for her 9 companions, she escorted them to a famous surfing break in Wailua on Kauai. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by a handsome surfer named Kānaka O Ke Kai. After describing the bending wave conditions at the esteemed Makaiva, he lent his 8-foot koa board to her. Oh, am I reading on the wrong? There we go. Okay. With impressive form, she quickly paddled the heavy board into the surf zone and began conversing with a group of surfers. Causing the waves to become small, Kapu'ula Kina'u drew their attention to the beautiful women on land. Enchanted, 8 of the men rowed to shore to meet them. Kapu'ula Kina'u then paired each man with 1 woman and sent them all back into the surf, so the men could court their new spouses to be. Meanwhile, Kānaka O Ke Kai had already fallen in love with the 9th woman, Kahala'i'a. Assured that her female companions would be cared for, Kapu'ula Kina'u anticipated the prospect of her own future and began thinking of pursuing a lover. Boy, she was quick to want to be an empty nester. But shortly thereafter, all the women, except Kahala'i'a, returned to shore without their surfing partners. After they explained each man's excuse for not marrying them, Kapu'ula Kina'u, relief quickly turned to rage. She charged out into the surf and challenged the 8 men to a contest or competition. "What are the stakes?" the men asked. "Our bones," she replied. Intimidated, but still interested, the men tried to keep up with the surfing sorceress. She then called the great waves of the deep ocean with her pohuehue vine and chanting. As the waves grew, only she was able to ride the monstrous surf. The waves eventually consumed the men and buried them in the Makaiva surf forever. Today, 8 submerged rocks symbolize these surfers and stand as a reminder to men to be both respectful and committed to women. Guys in the room? Even have one of my daughter's boyfriends in the room? I mean, only boyfriend. Anyway, so as seen in both ancient and modern times, Hawaiian surfers have placed a high value in the notion of respect in the waves. Like Hi'iaka and Kapu'ula Kina'u, Hawaiians in the 20th century took offense at surfers who failed to create and reciprocate relationships of respect and exchange. Although many assume that most tensions in Hawaiian waves is attributed to simply brute territorialism, I disagree. Disrespect and a lack of recognition are the core issues that ignite most conflicts in the Hawaiian surf. In the story of Iewale and Palani, for example, it was Palani's failure to recognize and respect Hi'iaka as an individual and a goddess that got him into trouble, not necessarily his claim over the territory of Kahana. In both ancient and contemporary Hawaii, recognition is still crucial in social settings. Recognitions of one's family, community, and origins are essential to social relationships, even in the surf. Thus, Hi'iaka, as a visitor to Kahana, followed proper protocol by recognizing Palani's family and status before she asked to enter. She was angered when Palani failed to reciprocate in the social exchange. So that's an important point that I really worked to articulate with the hui on the North Shore. It wasn't just about them feeling territorial. It was a deeper cultural exchange that would traditionally have more reciprocity that took place, where people respected and recognized someone. And I think oftentimes, unfortunately, maybe some of that is the product of colonial narratives, the idea that there is an other and they occupy a place that's less important, and so folks are less able to sort of recognize that. Well, I don't know how I'm doing on time here. Thank you for staying. Dr. Sai told me, I brought some students, but the class ends at 2:15, so they might dig out. But Hey, you guys will stick around, right on. Mahalo. We can open up for questions if you like, and I'm willing to answer as best I can.
You know, I noticed you mentioned just surfing, huh? But I think the Hawaiians have, well, I grew up from mountains to the sea,
Right.
and so that a lot of the things related to the ocean and the sea are connected up to the ocean and everything. So I want to notice that Chief Justice Richardson, the first Chief Justice, yeah, he's made it so that the government has the right to the wash of the wave.
Mm.
That's very unusual in that I don't think any other state in the U.S. has that kind of a thing about where the ocean ends. So that and so it creates, it doesn't change the ownership of the rig, but the state has the right to control that thing. So it's the ocean and the thing. And so Chief Justice Richardson made that law, and that changes everything about land use, because like we have Kai, and that's the south thing that the Hawaiian can can continue to use Native Hawaiian practices, even if it's owned by somebody else.
Right.
See, there's this notion about land ownership and thing in Hawaii is very different than on the mainland, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's because of the ocean and the thing is they look at that as a one entity.
Awesome. Thank you. And you're right. So many things that you said were awesome, and the Ahupua'a did extend out to the reefs. And if you go to a lot of Pacific islands today, it's still like that. Fiji, for example, or in Samoa, your village goes out to the reefs, and like the fishing in that area is part of your village. Yeah, and even like during COVID, there were a lot of places where you couldn't surf, but Hawaii, we still could. So a lot of that probably is that lack of control, like governmental control, I guess, over some of these spaces. We had a hand over here.
How you doing?
Good.
Thank you. Lance Kelly here we're from Wisconsin, native. We live on the Oneida Reservation. So I just want to thank you, everybody, and our friend here, Mel. So we're just visiting, but I really appreciate, a lot of similarities. I have a bunch of questions on Luke.
Okay.
But just seriously, with a cultural connection, as Native people, we have that with land, tribes on the West Coast, and, definitely the water. But for us, she always gives me a hard time because I'm a land Indian. but it is, part of that. And we went to the water, was it Sunday? And the waves were crazy.
Yeah.
But we were told not to go out and swim because obviously the danger. But there was kids, 8, 9, 10-year-olds, and he says, "Don't worry about them.
Yeah.
They know what they're doing." Definitely that experience, for that. So, but you talk about the political part, and my colleague here, I met him last year. From a Native perspective, you talk about the 70s. Definitely for us as Native people, we had our own movement.
Yeah.
American Indian movement. Definitely a lot of similarities. How much, from your own personal academic research, and just how do you see that can overlap?
Yeah, there definitely was. I can think of quite a few, but one that comes to mind with, AIM, the movement, when they occupied Alcatraz, I think that inspired a lot of, or PKO, which is Protect Kaho'olawe, to go and occupy the island of Kaho'olawe. I would say there's a relationship there. Also with voyaging, with the Polynesian Voyaging Society, they built wooden canoe. My son would kill me right now. What's the wooden canoe? Anybody remember the one that's Hawaii Loa? Thank you. I have a son who sails, and he actually went to Alaska and on Hokulea, my oldest, and went surfing there and was invited on tribal lands, and really cool experience for him. But they were going back to pay thanks to the native Alaskan tribes that had given them the logs for Hawaii loa. So yeah, there's a lot of connections that we share.
Follow-up question, unless someone else. You know, with the Iroquois Nation, you guys are talking about having your own Hawaiian team. So the Iroquois Nation is upstate New York. They have their own lacrosse team, and they have competed worldwide, you know, Junior Olympics, and they're trying to qualify for the Olympics in LA. So that's the hope, kind of similar to what you were talking about with the Hawaiian team. So it is out there.
Yes, thank you. We're looking at other sports other than just surfing too that we're working on. Oh, a hand here, sorry, and then we'll go to you in the back.
Just a quick comment on the fact that paddling ties
Yes.
into exactly the same parameters. And my family surfs, but there are also many, many paddlers.
Awesome.
And we went to Australia for a big international event. And they had set up tents along a mile of beach.
Mm.
And they had the U.S. at one end, and down at the other end, there was a Hawaii tent.
Yeah.
And somebody said, we're part of the U.S. And they said, oh, we're sorry, really? And we said, no, we're good.
We're good. No, you know, surfing's one example. I feel like, of course, like with canoe paddling and even non-ocean, I mean, there's so many pockets of autonomy that I think we overlook, social ones. I mean, I think of Hawaiian music. We have some Hawaiian musicians in the house running the programs here. Thank you for coming. But it's interesting, like throughout the era when Hawaiian language was not being taught in schools, you have this tradition of Hawaiian music that prevails. That's kind of unbroken chain too, right? Even at Kamehameha schools where they didn't teach Hawaiian at all, the song, yeah, but the song contests were songs they've been singing in Hawaiian. So it's interesting how music is also, I feel like, a very similar story someone could do on the way that music also kind of treads around your typical colonial narratives where there's a form of autonomy that exists through these different venues, whether it's surfing, canoeing, Hawaiian music. I think there's a lot of that's there. Yes, so you want to read this one? Because that's a long answer. But so how does the Hawaiian history overlap with surfing? So much. And that's really, I was tricking people with this book. They thought they were buying a book on surfing, and then after they read it, they're like, oh my gosh, that was a history of Hawaii. And surfing's just the vehicle for kind of keeping your attention through it all. Yeah, I mean, there's like surfing, I don't know exactly where you want me to go with this question, but there's a lot of events, like surfing events that take place in Old Hawaii, even in the 1890s. When they were doing this report, and Keanu has done a lot of research, of course, in this area, but right, so I'm trying not to get too in depth here because we don't have a whole lot of time, but when you had the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, who sent an investigative team to go and to do a report on the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, they stopped in Hilo, and there's a whole story of them watching a surfing competition there. There's also so many other examples of events that take place, not just surfing events, but others. But anyway, maybe I didn't answer your question sufficiently, but I apologize. Any others?
Are you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, did Dude swim in his first Olympics for Hawaii, right? Is that a precedent you're utilizing in trying to get Olympic surfing to be a Hawaii team?
We're trying to use we use the application, in the application process, the way that they define a nation or country it's pretty loose. And like there are certain, like they had, sorry, it's been a long day. But there's been countries that aren't recognized typically. For example, there was a refugee group a few years back that had gained a status, and so through Keanu's work, we showed that like Hawaii was recognized as an independent state, and so we're kind of hoping to kind of leverage that, and because being recognized as independent, really, the IOC, we're hoping will be a little bit more flexible with the way that they do that.
Good luck with that, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share a story. My grandfather grew up in Helekunihi near Kānaka on Waikiki Beach.
Oh, yeah.
And back in the day, in 1907 or maybe 1908, he tells the story of Alexander Hume Ford. You know, my grandfather would just hang out on the beach, and so Alexander Hume Ford comes up and, you know, wants these boys to teach him how to surf. And so they take him out, and I don't know how old Alexander Hume Ford was at the time, but my grandmother said he was elderly at that time. So they're trying to teach this guy how to surf, the guy who claimed to, you know, start Outrigger Canoe Club. And so they get him on a board, and you know, they snap a picture, but somebody is underneath the board, holding the board from him when the wave hits. And take the picture, so that's just a small, nobody's related to Alexander Hume Ford. But you know, somebody who's, you know, you talk about him in your book about kind of, you know, starting Outrigger Canoe Club and kind of creating this segregated, you know, group or the club, and you know, he couldn't even surf on his own. So.
Even doctoring his social media back then. Okay, any other questions?
So I actually read your book.
I love how you said that. I actually read your book?
In undergrad, and I looked at the copyright date. It must have been like hot off the presses, but I just wanted to. I actually read it in a women's studies class.
Oh,
Yeah, and your book really helped me, and my best friend was Kānaka too, but it like helped us really solidify the connection between the struggles of so many oppressed communities, because we learn about like why stereotypically, right, Black folks can't swim, and it's because they weren't allowed to. And then we learn about, like, we didn't even know so much of this history about how, but now, like the privatization of beaches and, you know, that new resort that's being planned for the west side. It brought so many things together for us that when I saw this, I like notes everything. But I was like, I texted my best friend and I was like, I have to go to this because I don't want to say it's life changing, but it really needed.
not quite. It's okay to say it.
It was like, but yeah, you just really helped make those connections feel really real for us. So.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that's, I'm glad you felt that way, because that's really what the book was trying to do too, is just to restore kind of the mana and the autonomy of the Hawaiian experience for a lot of people. And yeah, and you know, I'm glad you read it in a women's studies class, read this book in a women's studies class, because there is a lot, like even that sentence that I read earlier, most of the mo'olelo that are in our Nupepa is about women. And as the example I read today of Kapūʻula Kina'u and Hi'iaka are like powerful women who are demanding respect and drowning men who are not doing well and things like that. So it is a very interesting dynamic. Also, you know, to me, one of my favorite women that I talk about in this book is Princess Kaiulani, because she lived in an era when, you know, when women's roles were very much so, and her dad was from Scotland, and, you know, she was expected to behave a certain way that was proper, but it wasn't necessarily Hawaiian. And so she was trying to straddle both worlds, and she would surf regularly in defiance of her dad and her Scottish culture, and probably some missionaries that felt like it wasn't appropriate, or whoever was kind of dictating those kind of standards. So yeah, it is. I think it is, you know, an opportunity for people to feel a sense of pride and encouragement. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that for my family, I know that I've shared with you. I've taken classes with Dr. Walker before in my undergrad.
Dr. Kimokeo is one of my former students.
But before he even wrote the book, you know, we were having these conversations, talking about his doctoral research and stuff. But I know that for my dad, who was a part of the group in those early days, like, even though my dad is like local, brought up, and he didn't read the book, like, you're not gonna read your book. Because he lived it, you know.
Yeah.
Like, but me and my sister would share with my dad like interesting things from the book, you know, and like for him, like it was like it's like this validation of what they were doing wasn't what was being painted in the media. And you know, he just shared with me a story the other day about, and he said, yeah, you know, because we were like you talk in the book, establishing our space as Hawaiian men. And you know, at this time in the Hui, I think Mark Richards was the surf champ, like just won the championship. And my dad told me that they were surfing on a pipeline, and Mark Richards went for a wave, and my dad dropped in on him on purpose and made him eat it. That pipeline, when it's big, which is very dangerous. And my dad said he was mad. And so, which anyone that surfs, the person that drops in normally is not the angry one. But my dad was mad and paddled out to him and was like, if you see me going for a wave, stop. You know, and so he told me that their kind of reasoning was not just being punks, but he said, like, no surf champion is going to come to Hawaii and think that they dominate the water because they're a surf champion. You know, so it was really that last frontier, like you talk about that space of male dominance where we felt empowered in the water. So I mean, for my dad, I know it feels good hearing about your book, not reading.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your time and space with me. Appreciate it. Oh.
Is the book available for sale today here?
The book is not available for sale. Where can they purchase it?
Where can they
Amazon?
Yeah, you can purchase it on Amazon.
If you are a WCC or a UH patron, we have the book available online or
Don't buy it.
to borrow.
No, it's fine. I don't make very much money on the book directly, indirectly.
But yeah, there is an ebook version, and but yeah, buy it on Amazon. But we do have a copy you could borrow if you are a UH system user, or you could sit here in our beautiful building and read it. Yeah.
This is a beautiful building, by the way. Yeah.
Public library doesn't have it online.
I can check real quick for you.
Yeah,
They do? Yep. Oh, good. Yep.
Yeah, the book's kind of getting old, and maybe you were referencing that, like, oh, where's the next one? So hopefully that's coming out
Part two.
after the. All right. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming to this event and supporting the library and supporting Dr. Walker and just listening to all his fantastic stories. And thank you to all of you who shared your stories as well, because it really contributed to the quality of the event. Oh yes, and our next event is April 23rd, and we will have John Clark here to speak with us. Yep. So anyways, I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and thank you again for coming.
Tell your friends.
Yeah.